Paternity probability. The clinical phrasing felt like ice picks driven into his chest. He had suspected something for months. Lila's late-night phone calls, her sudden taste for high-end clothes, the way she recoiled when he tried to touch her. But this was another magnitude. Nuclear devastation wrapped in laboratory letterhead. Mark folded the papers and slid them into his toolbox, beside the industrial wrenches that had built his modest refrigeration repair business from nothing. 15 years of marriage. 13 believing he was a father. All of it stacked on lies, thick enough to choke. His phone buzzed. A text from Victor Hale, his so-called business partner and friend. "Hey buddy, got that wine fridge acting up again. Mind swinging by tonight? Lila said you're free." Mark stared at the message. Victor's house, where Lila spent Tuesday nights for book club, where she claimed to be discussing novels with the neighborhood wives. The same Victor who was helping Mark expand, providing parts at friendship prices. Mark typed back, "On my way." The drive to Victor's McMansion in Brookridge Heights took 12 minutes through suburban streets with perfect lawns and perfect lies. Mark pulled into the circular driveway, his scarred service truck looking like a tumor beside Victor's pristine BMW and Mercedes. Victor answered the door in a silk robe, hair still damp from a shower. "Mark, thanks for coming so late." The wine chiller just stopped cooling completely. "You know how it is? Expensive bottles." "No problem," Mark said, hefting his toolbox. "Lead the way." The house reeked of expensive cologne and recent company. Mark followed Victor through marble halls lined with abstract art that probably cost more than Mark earned in a year. They went down to a finished basement that felt like a gentleman's club. Leather furniture, crystal decanters, and the malfunctioning wine fridge humming angrily in the corner. "Started making weird noises yesterday," Victor said as he settled into a chair with a glass of scotch, "then died completely this morning." Mark knelt beside the unit, hands moving over familiar parts. Loose compressor belt. A basic 15-minute fix. He opened his toolbox and began, muscle memory working, while his mind ran darker calculations. "How's Lila doing?" Victor asked casually. "She seemed stressed last time she was here." Mark's wrench slipped, nearly skinning his knuckles. "When was that?" "Tuesday night. Book club. Between you and me, I think the ladies spend more time drinking than reading. Not that I'm complaining. Lila's great company." The belt snapped back into place with a clean click. Mark stood and brushed dust from his knees. "Mind if I use your bathroom?" "Long day." "Sure. Upstairs, primary bedroom. Only one with decent water pressure." Mark climbed the steps slowly, each one like walking toward his own execution. The primary bedroom was a monument to excess, an oversized king bed with black silk sheets, a walk-in closet bigger than Mark's garage, and a bathroom that belonged in a luxury hotel. He splashed cold water on his face and stared at his reflection in the gold-framed mirror. 41 years old, gray creeping through brown hair, hands permanently stained with grease and honest work. What had he expected? That a woman like Lila would be satisfied with a man like him forever. He reached for a towel and froze. Tucked behind a stack of costly bath products sat a Polaroid. His heart stopped. Lila, naked except for black lingerie he had never seen, posed on the marble vanity where he now stood. Her wedding ring glinted as she touched herself, eyes locked on the camera with a hunger he had not seen in years. The caption on the bottom, in her handwriting, read, "For my real man." Mark slid the photo into his pocket and walked downstairs on concrete legs. "All fixed," he said, as Victor refilled his scotch. Compressor belt was loose. "It should run fine now." "You're a lifesaver," Victor said, reaching for his wallet. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing. Friends help friends, right?" Victor grinned and offered his hand. Mark shook it, noting how soft Victor's palm felt compared to his own scarred knuckles. Rich man's hands. Hands that had never built, never fixed, never earned through sweat. "Lila's lucky to have a guy like you," Victor said. "Reliable, dependable, salt of the earth." Yeah, Mark replied. I know exactly what I am. The drive home felt like floating through a nightmare. The modest two-story colonial looked smaller than usual, dwarfed by the memory of Victor's mansion. Lila's car was not in the driveway. Still at book club, probably, or in Victor's bed. Mark sat in his truck for 20 minutes, staring at the house where he believed he was building a family. The Polaroid burned against his chest, tucked inside his work shirt near his heart. His phone rang. Lila said, "Hey, book club is running late. Don't wait up, okay? Love you." "Love you too," Mark answered, the words tasting like broken glass. The boys were asleep when he finally went inside. He stood in the doorway of their shared room, watching Ethan and Caleb breathe under superhero blankets. 11 and 8. DNA that traced back to Victor Hale, not Mark Bennett. They did not know that. They called him Dad, hugged him when he came home, asked him to fix bikes and help with homework. That love was real, even if the biology was not. Mark pulled out the paternity results and read them one last time before feeding the papers into the kitchen shredder. The machine chewed up the laboratory proof of his humiliation with mechanical efficiency. The Polaroid stayed. Lila slipped into bed at 2:17 a.m., ghost quiet. She smelled like expensive soap and unfamiliar cologne. Mark pretended to sleep, listening to the easy rhythm of someone with a clear conscience. Morning arrived with the usual chaos. Breakfast, backpacks, the boys arguing over cereal while Lila rushed around in her real estate clothes. She kissed Mark goodbye with lips that had wrapped around another man hours earlier. "Have a good day. Love you." "Love you," he said. After they left, Mark sat at the kitchen table and began to plan. Revenge was not a dish. It was a machine that needed careful assembly, precision, patience. One wrong move and the whole thing would explode in his face. First, he needed more evidence. The Polaroid was damning, but not comprehensive. He spent the morning installing a voice-activated recorder on Lila's laptop, buried deep in system files where she would never notice. Then he cloned her phone, redirecting copies of all texts and calls to a burner device he bought with cash. By afternoon, Mark had a complete picture of his wife's betrayal. Messages spanning 8 months, explicit photos, recordings of phone intimacy, while Mark worked late in the garage. Financial records showing Lila had been transferring money from their joint account to Victor's company. The worst discovery hid in a folder titled Future Plans. Legal paperwork, divorce documents already drafted, custody agreements giving Lila primary custody, while Mark paid maximum support for children who were not his. She had planned everything. The affair was not passion. It was strategy. Mark printed every document, every image, every thread. He arranged the evidence in manila folders like a case file because that was exactly what he was building. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of his life. He pretended everything was normal while cataloging every lie, every betrayal, every casual cruelty. Lila grew bolder, stayed out later, cared less about hiding her contempt for their boring life. "Maybe you should think about expanding the business," she suggested over dinner. "Victor says there's opportunity in commercial refrigeration. Big money." "Victor says a lot," Mark replied carefully. "He's trying to help you," she said. "We can't live like this forever." The boys watched their parents, sensing a pressure they could not name. Ethan reached over and patted Mark's hand. "Dad, are you okay?" "Just tired, buddy. Work stuff." That night, Mark listened to a call through his hidden recorder. Lila's voice crackled through the earpiece. "He's so pathetic. He just sits there like a kicked dog. I almost feel sorry for him." "Not much longer," Victor replied. "Once the divorce is through, you'll be free. We both will." "What about the boys? What about them?" "Mark will pay support, and they'll have a real father figure. Win-win." Mark clicked off the audio and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The end of the month brought his opportunity. Victor's warehouse in Fairview received a massive shipment of commercial units, a contract worth nearly $500,000. Delivery was scheduled for a Friday night when most shops were closed. Mark had studied the security for weeks. Victor was too arrogant to invest in real protection, leaning on basic cameras and motion sensors that a skilled technician could defeat. Friday night, Mark parked 6 blocks away and walked to the warehouse with a gym bag of tools. He cut through the fence behind the loading dock and disabled the alarm using techniques learned from 15 years of emergency calls. Inside, the building was a maze of stacked appliances and parts. Mark moved in the dark like a ghost, planting small devices. Not explosives. Nothing that would injure anyone. Something more elegant. Refrigerant gas. Ammonia-based coolant that would slowly leak from punctured lines through the weekend. By Monday morning, the entire warehouse would reek like a disaster zone. The health department would shut it down, and Victor's $500,000 contract would evaporate along with his reputation. Mark also tucked a few small packets of marijuana in strategic locations, just enough to trigger possession issues when police inevitably searched the contaminated building. The masterpiece waited in Victor's office. Mark installed code to corrupt the drive while uploading Victor's financial records to an anonymous tax fraud tip line. Built for ruin, Mark slept for 2 hours and woke with a plan so clear it felt like a ledger entry. He would let the small things fall and the big things follow. He returned to the warehouse in daylight to check the aftermath without touching a thing that could be traced to him. He stood at a distance across the street drinking coffee, watching the uniformed crews and the yellow tape. News vans rolled in. Reporters interviewed an anxious Victor who paced and muttered about ruined inventory and lost contracts. Mark watched Victor's face creak into something like panic and felt the hot, slow bloom of satisfaction someone had no right to feel. Within days, the story spread through the neighborhood like a stain. Clients canceled showings with Lila when a local real estate blog tied her name to the warehouse scandal. An anonymous tip had made certain investigators ask questions they would not have asked otherwise. Her major pitch fell apart after a catering mishap at an open house, and the insurance company refused one claim after another. Mark sat in his garage and watched the headlines while he kept repairing fridges and fulfilling service calls. He did not gloat in public. He kept the evidence folder where he could reach it, and, at night, listened to the recordings and read the messages until they blurred. Cara Lila grew reckless and then brittle. She started showing at home less. When she did, she was sharp and impatient. Once she left a bank card on the kitchen counter, and Mark saw larger withdrawals than their budget allowed. He printed the statements and added them to the file. He did not confront her until he was ready. The confrontation came indirectly. Michelle, Lila's sister, knocked on Mark's door and handed him the divorce papers, and Mark slid his proof across the coffee table without drama. Michelle's face crumpled. She had not wanted to know. She left, raw and reeling, and Mark let her go with instructions to think carefully before speaking to anyone without looking at the full picture first. Mark invited Victor and Lila both to the old ice factory under pretense of an insurance meeting. He sent separate messages and a single lie tailored to their weaknesses. He told himself the lie was a tool, not a betrayal. Truth, he thought, was no longer his to protect. He set the stage not to destroy them physically, but to expose them. He rigged the factory with videos and audio of their own words and kept everything legal where possible. Copies of documents, printed messages, recordings he had obtained from devices on his own network. He sat in the dark of the factory and waited. Victor arrived first with that nervous arrogance of someone who believes money buffers against humiliation. Lila came after, in heels that clicked like a metronome for his anger. When he stepped into the open, he kept his hands visible and his voice steady. He let the videos play so they would hear themselves. He played the calls where they planned to rewrite history and rearrange custody, and laughed about the ease of it all. Victor lunged once in a moment of blind bravado. Mark did not plan a savage beating. He restrained, he defended, and he used force only to stop a man who had once called himself a friend from doing more harm. The scuffle left Victor with a broken nose and a humiliation that could not be bandaged by designer shirts. Mark held the recordings up and let them speak. When he streamed the evidence to social media, it was not for revenge alone. It was for exposure. The clips were ugly. They were intimate and unflattering and sufficient. People commented and messaged and forwarded. Lila's professional contacts called her office and asked for explanations she had none to give. Victor's suppliers paused orders until audits cleared their name. Because he had compiled financial irregularities, tax authorities and corporate attorneys began to take interest. The fallout was swift in a way that mattered. In court, the files he had prepared with a careful attorney who specialized in paternity and fraud became the backbone of his case. Mark had not acted alone in the legal endgame. He had learned to translate evidence into paperwork, to put a human face on a grievance, and to let a judge and a jury parse that. The judge listened to recordings and read spreadsheets. Lila's prepared divorce papers and custody plans looked less like prudent planning and more like a contrivance designed to benefit the conspirators. Her license came under review. Victor's ledgers were inconsistent, and after an inquiry, his business faltered under audits and lost insurance claims. Mark never claimed victory in a celebratory way. When the judge read the verdicts, the relief that came through Mark was small and quiet. Lila was found guilty of fraud related to paternity and financial deception. She was ordered to compensate Mark for years of support taken under false pretenses. Victor faced business penalties and the slow, grinding consequences of financial collapse. The court handed Mark custody arrangements that kept the boys with him, while also ensuring they had access to counseling and a steadier childhood. In the months that followed, he worked the long days and the longer evenings with the same determination he used in his trade. There were awkward conversations with teachers and therapists and neighbors who found their loyalties tested. There were questions from friends about morality and whether his methods were themselves a kind of cruelty. Mark answered with little more than the truth, that he had been betrayed and that he had been calculatedly pragmatic about remedying an injustice that had been committed against him and his children. Ethan and Caleb needed time to understand. Their questions were honest and small. "Are they still our family?" "You are my sons," Mark told them, and he meant it, as absolute as a bolt tightened until it held. The boys attended therapy, and slowly learned that honest love includes truth even when it hurts. Mark sat in a folding chair at Little League and watched his eldest clip a double into left field. The sound the crowd made when the ball connected and the boy ran was like the clean report of a tool used well. Lila tried once to speak to him at the field. She looked like someone who had been stripped down by weather and circumstance, desperate and pleading. Mark turned away. He had no need for a reconciliation. He had built a life from honest labor and chosen to protect the children who called him Dad. He stepped into the glare of the spring sun and cheered as if the world contained only that one right present thing. The Polaroid that had started it all hung in the lower drawer of his workbench for some months, like a relic, and then one rainy night, Mark fed it into the shredder. He watched the paper become confetti and thought about forgiveness and justice and the peculiar emptiness of some triumphs. He kept what mattered: the boys, the business, and the knowledge that he could survive what someone else had intended to take. People asked if revenge had fixed him. He said it had not fixed him, but it had cleared the stage enough that he could keep working. Life, he discovered, does not arrest itself at the end of retribution. There were still taxes and leaks, and customers who expected fridges to be repaired on time. There were small, ordinary tasks that knit a life back together. He replaced a compressor one afternoon, and then took the boys to the park. He coached Ethan's team and taught Caleb to change a tire. In the quiet hours before dawn, he sometimes thought of the man he had been, softer, more willing to trust. He did not know if he would ever be that man again, nor did he particularly want to be. He had learned to make careful choices. He had learned to look at motives and not merely at words. When people asked him later how he had survived, he would say the obvious. He worked, he documented, and he relied on the law when he needed it. He spoke honestly about pain and the necessity of help. He never once offered instructions for sabotage or revenge. That part of the story belonged only to him. The rest belonged to the boys gathered around him at bedtime, asking for another story. He told them one about a repairman who fixed more than machines. They fell asleep to the sound of his voice,